COVID, kind of New York City pandemic work life that really started my thinking about doing something else. And the reality was that was a really hard time to be in practice, especially in New York, balancing working in COVID wards, doing tele-epilepsy from home, and all the kind of craziness that we had to do. When we got back to normal, right? Like afterwards, which obviously never really got back to normal, everything was just an elevated level of intensity. It was see more patients, deal with this backlog, do more service.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Be Empowered, the podcast. This is a podcast where we dive into the realities of healthcare and entrepreneurship. We offer our opinion, unfiltered, unapologetic, and always with a dose of empowerment. We're here to amplify voices, yours and ours, challenge the status quo, and explore what it truly means to thrive. So let's get into it. Today, we have Dr. Michael Boffa. He's a board-certified neurologist, epileptologist, and clinical neurophysiologist. He's currently medical director of clinical development, and we're so excited to have him today. I used to work with Mike. We know each other off the podcast, and he's one of the physicians who was actually able to pivot to pharma. And so I thought this would be good to have a conversation with him, since so many doctors actually, I think, are trying to do that. So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to see you again, and really happy to be here and get to talk a little bit about my experience, and hopefully we can, bring to light some of the things that will help other people if they're considering a similar shift.
So do you want to just start by quickly telling us how you got into pharma, like, how you started off in medicine, what drew you initially to academics, and then how you made that pivot?
Sure. So I think it's funny, right? When you think about why you went into academic medicine, I think the default answer is, well, when you go to residency and you go to fellowship, you just kind of assume that you're going to go into academics, right? Like I didn't really give it a lot of thought at the time. It wasn't like, oh, I want to be in academics. And maybe there are a lot of people who start with that, like, oh, I want to go in and go up the academic totem pole. But for me, it was more like, my whole medical career at that point was at academic institutions, right? So it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time, which was, hey, I'm in residency, and my program director was incredible, but he would say things like, academics is like the goal, and like that's what we should be part of, and same thing at fellowship. It was very much like, academics. And so I just kind of rolled into academics, not really realizing at the time that there was even any other options, right? I worked in academics for quite some time, and it wasn't really until the last few years I was practicing that I kind of started to think, hey, maybe there's something else out there, right? And truthfully, I didn't even think of it as an option. And the funny thing is, since I've made the switch too, I've had this exact conversation with like friends in other areas of medicine who kind of were on this like straight and narrow, like the only option is academics, right? Which is not true, which is why we're having these kinds of conversations. But yeah, so personally, how it happened for me. So in like full transparency, I know you probably hear this a lot. I think it was the COVID, kind of New York City pandemic work life that really started my thinking about doing something else. And the reality was that was a really hard time to be in practice, especially in New York, balancing working in COVID wards with, doing tele-epilepsy from home, and all the kind of craziness that we had to do. When we got back to normal, right? Like afterwards, which obviously never really got back to normal, everything was just an elevated level of intensity. It was see more patients, deal with this backlog, do more service. And the funny thing is, those weren't the things that I enjoyed most out of being in an academic center, right? Like I enjoyed seeing patients. I enjoyed my one-on-one interactions with them for sure. But I also loved teaching, right? I also loved exploring my research interests. I also was, prior to the pandemic, starting to dip my toe into kind of getting more involved in the clinical trials, right? And thankfully, I had friends who were involved in them and were able to kind of push me to be more involved as well. But the reality is the time that we had to kind of explore the more fun aspects of kind of academia, right? Or not necessarily fun, because it's all fun. Like what I found personally more interesting, we weren't really given much time to do that anymore, you know? And it was just like this overwhelming pressure of like, hey, like, yes, we're really happy that you want to teach and we're really happy that you want to be involved in research, but we also still need you to see like 80% more patients, right? And that kind of like intense world that we were kind of moving into where the expectations just were going up year over year, it was like, taking a lot of the enjoyment out of the day to day, right? Because yes, I don't have to teach, but I got a lot of joy out of teaching residents. And so at the end of the workday, I would go home and after dinner, work on the things for the next day, right? Like work on some presentations or work on like an EEG lecture. And while that is, great, it wasn't really compatible with like a good quality of life lifestyle anymore. And so I was starting to really feel that kind of pressure and burnout. And thankfully for me, my husband, he works in pharma, right? And he was this little like bug in my ear kind of over and over again being like, well, you really like the science. You really like the research. Why don't you look into pharma? Why don't you look into pharma? And I always just kind of like poo-pooed it, I was like, no, 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 I'm going to stay in academia. That's what we're supposed to do. I'm supposed to just be here. And oh, man, there was one like particularly rough weekend. I remember being on call and I was just so completely, utterly wiped. And I finally said to him when I was just like flopped on the couch at like 9 p.m. on a Sunday night, I was like, you know what, maybe I do need to see if there's something else out there. And so I started looking into it, right? And so at that point, in epilepsy, um, I think for better, people say for better or worse. I really do think for better. We have a lot of interaction with pharma in epilepsy because we're so reliant on the next thing, right? We want to help our patients, and we have so many patients that just don't respond to the available treatments we have that we need this innovation. We are really reliant on pharma companies coming up with new treatments, new drugs, new indications, because we need more things to help the patients we have. There's not enough. I mean, yes, we've had a fantastic renaissance when it comes to like treatment of epilepsy in the last 20 years, still not enough. And so because I had worked with so many of them already, getting involved in things like clinical trials and, just working with our reps, engineers, MSLs on these really complicated patients and really complicated cases, I had a lot of networking that was already done for me. Like I knew a lot of people. And so when someone would come call on me when I was programming a neuropace with the neuropace engineer, for a particularly complicated one, I would pick their brain and be like, so tell me a little bit about like what it's like being, an MSL in biotech or an engineer in biotech, or, do you like it? What don't you like? And I just started picking their brains. And after a while, it got to the point where I was kind of like picking their brains and then like, hey, and if by any chance you guys are ever looking for a physician to come work with, keep me in mind. Like I'm interested. I think what you do is interesting. And it's funny. That was actually probably like the best way that I found out about jobs or like was able to kind of get my foot in the door, right? Because getting into pharma is a bit of a challenge for sure. um, and I've had this conversation a couple times with like physicians who I know who have reached out to me and been like, hey, how did you do it? Like, I've been trying to do it for a couple months and I've been really struggling. I can't get my foot in the door. In all honesty, that's the truth. The hardest part about getting a job in pharma is truly getting your first job in pharma. And that's because everybody wants someone with experience. And it's funny because you'll never get that experience if nobody gives you the opportunity. But for us, as academic clinicians, we have a lot of skills, but pharma is like a completely different job, right? I really had to learn a whole new skill set and a whole new kind of way of thinking and acting, and so networking was really the way I got my foot in the door, and I'm happy to talk about that a little more. But that was really the best thing that I did, was leaning on all those connections that I already had with people who work in pharma, to try to get somebody to say, hey, look at this guy's CV, look at his credentials, because the reality is the people that work in HR, and a lot of them were like AI responses, would just kind of like close the door on you right on the spot. They're like, oh, no experience, no experience, no, not realizing that, well, yeah, maybe you don't have pharma experience, but you've been in practice for 15 years. You definitely have a lot of relevant experience to medicines and therapeutics and epilepsy.
Well, you answered a lot of questions that I had. Going back to what you said in after COVID, is like the more you strive, the more is expected, right? A lot of it was taken away from the joyful moments that we have in medicine, and the reason why we went to medicine, to see the patients, to have one-to-one teaching, things like that. But it was mostly, other things that we had to that we have to deal with. At the time before transitioning, did you voice concerns, or did you feel that you were supported, but it was just kind of, not sustainable anyways?
So in academics in particular, there's this kind of expectation, even being in practice like 7 or 8 years, you're still considered like junior faculty, or, even being promoted or whatever. I mean, one attending, nicest man in the world, didn't mean anything by it. I think I was an attending for 6 years already. And he said, oh, we can just have the fellow Mike do it. And I'm like, hey, we've been partners for like 6 years. Like, I'm not the fellow anymore, but the reality is like, sometimes it's hard to be like the squeaky wheel, right? You want to like ask for resources, you want to ask for time, and you do it a few times, and sometimes you're heard, sometimes you get something, and then sometimes you just get ignored. But I think the problem was, pre-COVID, I think we had more resources to go around, and not just because of COVID. I think also because, year over year, like the reimbursement for EEGs were being cut, and like, our VU expectations were going up, and all those kinds of things. Maybe it was a little bit more supportive before. I think in the post kind of COVID world, when you'd ask for things like time, they weren't able to give it to you. And whether or not that was like the other physicians in the practice, or the administration, or the pressure from above, there were these expectations that were being set. And, as a physician in the trenches, right, like, we're not involved in these conversations. Nobody says, hey, how many patients do you think you can see in a day? Or how many, what's a reasonable amount of time for you to talk to this new patient, right? We don't get to be involved in those conversations. And I think the problem is, because I think like the physicians who are doing this all on a day-to-day basis have less and less kind of a voice in those conversations, it makes it really hard and challenging for them to kind of support us when we say we need more. And I don't know whose fault that is, right? Like, I wouldn't blame like any one person in particular, but I do think that it can be really hard, when you feel like you're not being heard. Like, because I would say things like, hey, I really want some more time. Like, if I'm going to be running, if I'm going to be the site director for trials, I'm entitled to some time to devote to that, right? Instead of me doing it at home. You could get an answer of, sure, that sounds reasonable, but we also still can't reduce your RVUs, because who's paying for that other part of your salary, right? Or who's going to pick up those other RVUs? Or we're a group practice, or yes, we're going to hire someone, but we need to get funding, and it's going to be down the line. And, I think everybody has good intentions, but the reality is like, resources are very constrained in medicine. And I think especially in academic centers, where you have all of these different layers of people controlling kind of what you do. So that was a very long way of saying, ultimately, I did get frustrated with kind of waiting for these kind of beneficial changes to happen, right? Like, you'd say things like, hey, I really want a little bit of time for this, or maybe like a little bit less call, or, a little more education time that I can devote to teaching because I'm doing it at 8 in the morning and then running the clinic and coming back and rounding, and whose fault that is, and whether or not that's unique to any institution, I doubt it. I talk to friends that are at all different institutions all over the country, and everybody faces similar things. They're always like, oh, they're telling me we're going to hire someone, or, oh, I'm on call more than I should have been, or I'm seeing double the amount of patients, or squeezing it in. And I think it's just, we don't have enough physicians, we don't have enough resources, and that's the reality of the situation, right, that we're kind of in. And it makes it hard to find the joyful moments, the spending a little bit of extra time getting to know your patient and things like that, because in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I have 16 people waiting. I need to go. I have to get to the hospital and round later. I have to get back home and, write those EEG reports. And it's quite a challenge.
So you said that in academic jobs, they after 6 years they called you the fellow. So it's not just in academic jobs. Unfortunately, I experienced the same thing because I stayed in where I did my fellowship. So the organization, they always see you, or your program director, whoever, they always see you as that junior, sometimes child, sometimes fellow, sometimes they treat you like a resident, and it was interesting because for me also, it's been 5 years, and I was attending a conference. My program director was also there, or previous program director. At that time, we were both partners in this organization. And then it's interesting because when she was giving a presentation, she wanted to introduce me to the audience. She introduced me as the fellow. This is the first fellow, and it was interesting to me. It was like, even though I was even assistant medical director at that time, but I was not introduced even as the assistant medical director. I was introduced as the fellow. I always say, to and Santoshi and I talked about this in one of our other episodes as one of the solutions, that do try not to stay where you get your training or your fellowship, because you're not going to grow enough, in the eyes of your mentors. You're always that person who doesn't know enough and has not grown enough. So I think this is a very good lesson, for all of us to learn from.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's interesting, like, because just like I said, like I kind of just fell into academics. I just kind of assumed I would stay at the same place, and and it was great. Don't get me wrong. There were a lot of benefits to that. The system, the people you've trained with, there's benefits for sure. But I think you hit the nail on the head. It's harder to kind of step into a role and kind of be seen as just that when you're at a place where everyone's seen you when you were a resident, when you were a med student. It's definitely a challenge. And I think it's funny to kind of just even to prove your point a little more. Now I'm in pharma, I'm working a lot with the same people, but I'm in a completely different role at a different institution, and they're seeing me thrive there, and I'm coming back and working with them on things. And I was telling Santoshi and you right before we, started this, like I feel like I've gotten closer and probably garnered even a lot more respect from a lot of the people that I used to work with on a day-to-day basis in this new role now, right? And it's really kind of interesting because, I'm still working just as, diligently as I did before, and everything very similar, but I think they're seeing me in a new light because I'm off somewhere else, doing something else, and coming back to them with like my ideas and thoughts and how we can work together. So it definitely, it kind of strengthens your point, right? Like you go off, do something else, and it's definitely got a lot of benefits, and it's been a really great experience for me. So.
Yeah, and 100% agree with everything that you said, Mike. And I know how you feel because we left around the same time, and we were having similar experiences. I think the other thing is when you're in academics, it's hard to ask for something because it's almost a badge of honor to work very hard, right? You can't say, oh, I'm struggling, I need help, because if you're working yourself to death, that's a good thing. That's what's expected. So I totally agree with you on that. Now, in terms of the job search and like the interviews, I know we were going to talk a little bit about networking. I just want to ask one other thing, because I've tried to talk to pharma companies myself. some of these companies do want you to have certain certifications or like masters for clinical research, only because you and I were on like the clinical end of things. I think you did a lot more research than I did with the clinical trials, but in terms of building protocols and doing like safety reporting, that kind of stuff. Did you have to go through any of those certifications? And if not, did you just solely got your interviews through networking?
Yeah, so I can answer both of those a little differently. So regarding certifications, I never had to do any sort of masters or anything like that. To your point, you're right. You and I were both kind of primarily clinical. I finally had a little bit more of an opportunity to be like the site director, and I worked on a lot of the studies. I was able to get a lot of exposure in a short time and did like IRB reviews for a lot of the kind of protocols that would come in. So I would do like the complicated epilepsy and autoimmune epilepsy protocol reviews. So I had a decent amount of experience, but you're 100% right. Like I never did like any sort of masters, or I was never a primary PI, right? Like I was a sub-I and things. I think that was definitely a little strike against me. However, when I was in my interviews and people were asking me questions, it was very clear that I had enough knowledge of like how protocols work and exposure to protocols and having read through and reviewed protocols for the IRB and all of those things that I think kind of combined with like my CV and like my experiences and kind of the whole package was enough to kind of get me a pass on not necessarily having done like a PhD or a master's in clinical research or things of that nature. But I think that goes back to kind of the how I found the job, right? So I mean, the whole story, but the shorter version, for better or worse, it reached a point where I kind of was feeling very dissatisfied with the whole kind of academic medicine. My husband was getting a new job. We were going to be moving anyway. And it was like, hey, maybe I'm going to really aggressively look for something kind of outside academics, right? And so what I did was three different things, and I did them all at the same time. So number one was, like I said before, every time an MSL or a sales rep or someone from a pharma or biotech came to our office, I'd just pick their brain a little bit and I'd be like, and do me a favor, if you guys are looking for a medical director, if you're looking for someone in ClinDev, if there's a job in your company in any kind of aspect, like please feel free to like reach out to me. I'd be really happy to, talk about it. I'm really interested. And so that was like the personal networking, right? And a couple of them actually came back to me and said, hey, like, my boss is going to AES, or so and so from my company is going to AES this year. And that was the AES down in Nashville. And that year, I sat down with like a bunch of different people and I just told them a little bit about why I want to make the switch. I'm interested in clinical research. I really enjoy that part of my job. As much as I love, certain aspects of my current job, there's a lot of really talented researchers at my institution. I'll never get to be the clinical researcher. I'll never be that person. We talked about it, and a couple of them connected me with people within their company who had positions they were hiring for. So that was like the personal networking. And I will tell you, that was the highest yield, right? So like out of all the times I did that, I got the most job offers. I actually got 3 job offers that way. And these were for roles that had prerequisites of like being a medical director for like 2 years or like 5 years of pharma experience or things like that. The other 2 ways I looked for jobs were, one is I went to all the websites for all the companies that make epilepsy medications and I went to their job listings, right? Just manually looked up Eisai, looked up Biogen, looked up anyone I remembered had something in the pipeline or something they were building. And I looked to see if they had any jobs in, clinical development, because that's what I was interested in. And I applied to those jobs by emailing whichever person they told me to reach out to. That was lower yield, like really, I think I got 1 interview that way. The vast majority were just like these generated responses of like, thanks for your interest, but we're looking for someone with experience, et cetera. And then the lowest yield, but I still did it, was kind of through LinkedIn, which tons of job opportunities. Like if you go into LinkedIn jobs and you put in like medical director, there's like hundreds. You might be like, why would I never find a job in here? Like there's so many opportunities. But like literally, I applied to probably like 50. I got never an interview, never a response. It was purely just like AI generated, like no thank yous or just ghosting, right? So it was like a really low yield. However, what it did show me was that there were other types of jobs in pharma and biotech that I didn't even know existed. And I think that's part of it too. Like the only thing I had considered at that point was clinical development because it was related to what I had been doing. And it's the people who I was interfacing with on the clinical trial side. And so that was what I was considering. But what I learned from LinkedIn is there's jobs in medical affairs. There's jobs in, pharmacovigilance. There's jobs in kind of clinical pharmacology and safety, medical monitoring, in, kind of there's a lot out there that you don't even know exists. Which goes back to my whole point of when I went into academics, I had no clue that like 90% of the other types of jobs for physicians out there even existed, right? And so that actually helped me a lot because I learned a lot about like the different roles and responsibilities. And, it might be easier for someone making the switch to get a job as a medical monitor before they go to be, like a medical director, right? Because medical monitoring is more similar to what we do in clinical practice, right? So, like Santoshi, you were saying, you were more clinical, and some of the pushback from some of those jobs was like, well, you don't have like the clinical research. Well, see if anyone's looking for a medical monitor. I mean, that's basically like safety, like our vitals health labs good? Are there AEs popping up, right? Things we did every day for our patients. We'd look, they'd come in, you review their labs, and you say, oh, your LFTs are trending up and you're on Depakote. Like we need to think about what's going on here, right? And that one's a no-brainer. But that's another type of role in industry, gets your foot in the door. When I hit my 1 year anniversary, from then on, I get nonstop recruiter emails and messages being like, we need a physician in pharma. We need a physician who has pharma experience. We need a physician who has pharma experience. The minute you get that first year of experience, your value just skyrockets because now you're a specialist, and anyone trying to make a CNS drug, specifically epilepsy CNS, who needs a physician who has experience, they're going to the pool before they start going out to the people who have no experience in pharma. And so once you're in, even if the role isn't something that you're dead set on, it makes getting subsequent jobs a lot easier. I'll tell you the story of one of my friends who actually started pharma 2 months before I did. She started in clinical development. She didn't love it. And after a year, she got recruited to go be a medical director for a medical affairs group, which made her a lot happier. She worked on publications. She gets to do more interfacing with other physicians, collaborating on like ISTs and physician-led projects. And she really enjoyed medical affairs. And she never even considered it because she, like me, had had a little bit of experience in kind of like clinical development and thought, hey, I'm going to go do that. But she liked that so much more. And so it's really interesting in general. I think we all think we get a job. I think physicians are like this. You get a job, you stick with that job. It's really hard to break free, right? I mean, like Santoshi, like we talked about, think about how long you probably thought about leaving before you actually left, right? And that's because we think like, oh, I got this job, I should stay, I should do this, I should build. Things are going to get better. I'm going to get promoted. I'm going to do this. In other industries, people move jobs all the time, but physicians were so like hesitant to do it. There's this like bias where you just think I need to stay, I need to stick with one thing. But that's not necessarily the case. And now that I'm in pharma, I see that, right? Like I can see all these branches of opportunities. If I really wanted to go do something else, I absolutely could. Now, I happen to love what I do. I love clinical development. I love my job. I love my company. I feel like they really have a patient-centered focus. They really care about epilepsy. And so I'm not looking for something else, but I also feel if I wanted to do something else kind of within the pharma biotech space, I absolutely could, And so it's very different. It's a different mindset for sure.
You mentioned that most physicians, they stay in their jobs and they don't search for other jobs or look for other jobs. Because one, I think we are being guilt tripped into failing and quitting. It's like, no, this is a job, this is a calling for you, so you have to do it, right, forever. And then the other one, we really have, most of us, we have tunnel vision. When we graduate, we are so, and even, I would say, even before starting, most of us, we decide to become doctors and physicians early on. It's like, okay, I was in middle school, and I wanted to help, or some personal stories there, and then you have tunnel vision, right? Or at least I did. I had tunnel vision that all those years I never even thought about any other job. It's just, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor, and that continues until later, even in life, into attending life. And it's just, you feel like you are quitting, so that's why you try so hard to fix things. You try so hard to voice your concerns. You try so hard, and it becomes exhausting, right? It becomes a mental exhaustion, physical exhaustion. Unfortunate that we get to that. My question is that, what was most surprising for you when you started pharma?
There were a lot of things that were surprising. I think the biggest, right when you ask the question, the thing that comes out of my brain is that it is truly a completely different career, right? Like, you think, oh, I'm a physician, like I know medicine, I'm going to go in, and it's going to be easy. And it was like, no, this was not easy. This was quite a transition, right? It was learning a completely different career. And yes, having knowledge of clinical trials and protocols and epilepsy and medications in epilepsy made me useful for sure while I was learning how to be a medical director in pharma, because I was able to still contribute in those ways. But my word, I had to learn so many things. It was like drinking from a fire hose. Every day I was learning like 47 new things, and it was and it was a shock. It was not what I expected. I expected to come in and just be like, oh, I know how to do medicine, therefore I'll know how to do pharma. But that was not the case. It was very different. I think some of the other things that surprised me were, pharma has a little bit of a reputation when you think of how physicians in academic centers or in the world perceive it. It's this big bad, it's this black box, it's this kind of questionable thing. I was actually very pleasantly surprised with just how patient centric a lot of our decisions were, and how much we really kind of took literally direct feedback from patients, direct feedback from caregivers, direct feedback from patient organizations, just how much we work with those patient organizations, how we, like, not figuratively, but literally, when we're developing a protocol, we have meetings with patient advocacy groups, and get their input, right? Like, hey, what is your life like? How can we make your life better? What is important to you? Not what does the physician think is important to you, but to you directly. And I was really relieved when I found that, because prior to coming over, I was a little bit worried, being I just like you said, my origin story. Why did I want to be a physician? Well, I wanted to help people my whole life. I really liked helping people. And I was worried that, in the back of my mind, the little seed of like, hey, pharma's maybe not so good. Am I going to get there and be the one being like, oh, well, we should do this? And they're going to be like, no, there's no business case for that. We'll never do that, And, but it really wasn't like that. And I felt very pleasantly surprised. Now, I can't speak for all companies. Obviously, I just work for one, but I do believe that, like, as a mission, my company really cares about patients with epilepsy in the epilepsy space and has done a lot. And I've really appreciated just how many opportunities I've had to still interact with patients and still interact with patient advocacy groups and caregivers and things like that, because those interactions were so meaningful when I was in practice that it still warms my soul to see, a patient get up and say, you guys made my life better, or to hear from patients, what we can do, and then see us put that into practice, right? And so I think those were probably the two most surprising things, truly, that obviously the number one being the really just like it's a whole new career, it's a whole new way of thinking about problems, and so it was a lot of work making the switch, but truly just being really impressed with just how much I still get to feel like a caregiver. I still get to feel like someone who can provide, and because that's one thing I do miss a little bit, I would say, is the direct one-on-one. You start a patient on the right combination of medicine, they come back a month later and they're like, this is the first month I've ever not had a seizure, and you get that joy, right? And so do I miss that? Yes, right? At the end of the day, that's something really special that as physicians we get to do for other people. But I think I take a lot of joy from what I do still, because I know I can bring new medicines to the table. I can bring new indications to the table. I can do things for patients, bring them opportunities that they wouldn't have had before, and help a lot more patients that way. And I still get some of that feedback when we do these things where we interface with the patients and care groups and things like that directly. So it's a really nice feeling when you get to kind of think about it that way.
We're going to pause here for this week, but don't go too far. We'll be back for part 2 next week, and we'll tune into the rest of the conversation. Thank you.